Throughout my life, I have always loved baking. My family used to have Saturday cookie night where we would all gather in the kitchen to make chocolate chip cookies. Most of my weekends as a child were spent in the kitchen with my dad making family recipes. Baking has always been something that brings my family together. It has served as a creative outlet for me in my life and a way to connect with the people that I care about. As famous baker Buddy Valastro said, baking is about moments. It's about making those moments special. This quote really resonated with me throughout my project. For my first cake, Hi, my name is Claire Ulrich, and for my senior project, I researched and learned different piping techniques for decorating cakes. Using these skills that I learned, I created 4 cakes, which I then donated to members of the community who I feel make a positive difference. For my first cake, I decided to focus on borders and writing. There are many different types of cake borders, varying in difficulties. I decided to start with the shell border, which is a relatively simple border to learn. I watched YouTube videos to practice, and practiced doing the border on parchment paper until I felt confident with the skill. I loved doing this border on my cakes because it was quick to do, but still looked really impressive. Writing was a skill that was a lot harder to learn and took a lot of time and practice. In order to practice, I started by tracing letters that I had printed out, which were covered with parchment paper, using a piping bag with frosting. Once I felt confident with that, I freehanded the letters and words. Then, finally, I piped directly onto the cake. Writing was always the most stressful part of making the cake, and it took a delicate hand, the right amount of pressure on the piping bag, and careful planning to make sure that the letters were centered. I donated this cake to the Town of Bow offices shortly after the presidential election. When I heard that several town office employees worked over 12 hours to run the election, I knew that I wanted to give them something to thank them for all the work that they had done. When I went to drop off this cake, I was incredibly nervous. It was my first drop-off, I wasn't sure how they were going to react, and I felt very strange walking into the town offices holding a cake. But the people in the voting department were incredibly grateful, which I should have expected, because everybody loves cake, right? Their reaction gave me more confidence going forward and motivation for the rest of my project. For my next cake, I also used the shell border and writing, but this time I didn't have to spend as much time practicing these skills because I was already confident with them. To add to this cake, I piped rosettes. The rosettes were similar to the shell border, but it involved piping in a circular motion to create a rose-like shape instead of piping in a line. The practice that I had with the shell border helped me a lot when making this border and made it much easier for me to do. I donated this cake to my class at the Concord Regional Technical Center, where I'm a student in the Culinary and Pastry Arts program. Each month, my program has a dinner for all of the students in our class. This month, they had a Thanksgiving dinner, and I decided to donate a cake to them to share with all of my classmates. It felt so rewarding to be able to share my cake with people who knew how much time and effort went into making something like this, and I was so grateful to get the chance to share my baking with them. For my third cake, this was one of the most meaningful moments of my project, and it was also the first cake that I made that I felt completely satisfied with. At this point in my project, I was gaining more confidence, and I had more practice with the techniques. I wanted to create a cake that would reflect the skills that I had learned, and so I wanted to add new borders and more elements. This cake was Christmas themed and used a spiral border and stripe piping on the sides. The spiral border is similar to the shell border, but it involves tracing the piping bag in overlapping circles to create a spiral line, similar to the rosette piping technique. For the stripes on the side, I used a plastic cake scraper that had squares cut out of it, so then when I smoothed it around the white buttercream, it would leave indents in the cake, which I could then pipe red buttercream into and smooth all the frosting out to create stripes. One tip that I found to help me with this was taking a metal cake scraper and heating it up under running water so that then, when I smoothed out the cake, it would melt the frosting slightly and create cleaner lines. Lastly, I added a few dots of green on top in a circle with a bow to create a wreath. As this was around Christmas time, I knew that I wanted to do something to thank all the first responders in Bow, because while I was at home enjoying the holiday with my family, they were away from their families. So, on Christmas Eve, I drove over to the Bowtown Safety Center. Now, again, I was very intimidated, and I felt out of place walking into the police department, not with an emergency, but with dessert. The police officer who came to greet us was very surprised and thankful. In fact, because of this and the joy that I felt when I donated this cake, I hope to make it a tradition going forward to bring baked goods to the first responders on Christmas Eve to thank them for their selfless service during the holidays. My fourth and final cake was definitely the hardest cake to make, but another incredibly meaningful and rewarding experience. For this cake, I created a flower basket cake using the basket technique on the sides and roses and flowers on the top. The basket technique involves using a basket piping tip, which is a tip that's flat on one side and has a cone-like shape on the other side. You then pipe parallel lines up the cake that look like they weave together to create the basket. Roses are a skill that I love to do, but have always struggled a lot with. To improve on this, I watched YouTube videos and practiced one as I was creating the roses. The rose technique involves using a rose nail, which is almost like a mini cake turntable, and a petal tip to pipe overlapping petal shapes, working from the inside of the flower to the outside. I donated this cake to the teachers and staff here at BHS, who have helped me so much throughout my 4 years here. I felt that this was the perfect way to end my project, as I'm nearing the end of my senior year. It meant so much to me to be able to show my appreciation for all the people that have helped me to be where I am today. This experience was incredibly rewarding, and I received a lot of great feedback from several of my teachers. Now, while my project had a lot of meaningful moments and successes, it definitely was not a piece of cake the whole time. I had to experiment with several different buttercream frosting recipes until I found one that was perfect for piping. The recipe that I used had to be smooth and light, but hold its shape enough when piping. In the end, I ended up trying 6 different recipes before I found one that I really liked and wanted to use going further. I also found that I had to push myself out of my comfort zone with this experience. I'm a perfectionist, especially when it comes to baking, but this had to be set aside for the sake of my project. I found that I had to throw away perfectionism because it was constantly preventing me from working efficiently or ever being completely happy with the cakes that I made. Once I stopped focusing on being perfect, I found that I had more room for creative liberty. I had more fun, I was more proud of the cakes that I made, and I was able to overlook the minor imperfections. Throughout my project, my baking and decorating skills improved, which I expected. But, unexpectedly, one of the biggest takeaways from my project was the connections that I was able to make with members of the community. I gained so much more from this project than I originally thought that I would. The happiness that I felt when I was able to show my appreciation for the people that I cared about through my baking was so impactful to me. Seeing how grateful people were for the cakes that I made for them was so rewarding. So, next time you find yourself baking, or even cooking, take a moment to stop and think about all the ways that food may connect you to the people in your life. These connections are the true icing on the cake. I would like to say thank you to Mrs. Schreiner, Mrs. Dustin, my CRTC instructors, my family, and anyone who was willing to eat the cakes that I made. And thank you to you for taking the time to hear my senior talk today. Does anyone have any questions? Ella?
What was the favorite cake that you made?
Ooh, I think my favorite cake was the flower basket cake because this was the last cake and I really like how it turned out. I spent a lot of time on it, but I was really happy with the result, and I was really happy to be able to donate it to all of my teachers. Patrick?
How long did it take you to make that flower basket cake?
So I split it up over 2 days. On the first day, I baked the cake and made the frosting, so I would say that took about 2 hours. And then the second day, I frosted and decorated the whole cake, and that took about 4 hours. So I would say in total, it took about 6 hours to make that cake. Mrs. Schreiner?
Did you get to taste any of your cakes?
I did, yeah. I would eat the scraps off of the top of them because when I baked them, they would have a dome on the top, so I leveled that off, and so I would snack on those while I was making the cake.
Good for you.